You pick up your phone without a reason. There's nothing you're looking for, no notification pulling you in, but your thumb is already moving. You open an app and scroll past something that doesn't register, then something else that doesn't register either. 10 minutes go by, 20. You put the phone down feeling worse than before you picked it up, and then, somehow, you pick it up again. You know this feeling, that strange paralysis where you can't commit to doing something, but you also can't commit to doing nothing. You're suspended between the two, locked in a state that offers no rest and no productivity and no pleasure, just time dissolving beneath you. Some people call it doomscrolling, though that word implies you're consuming bad news, disaster after disaster. Often you're watching nothing in particular, funny videos, recipes you'll never make. The content doesn't have to be negative to leave you feeling hollowed out. Others call it brain rot, or phone addiction, or just a bad habit. But whatever name we give it, the behavior points to the same thing. We are using our phones as an escape, a constant flight from the emptiness of a life that feels like it should mean more than it does. And we assume this belongs to us, to this generation, to the age of the algorithm. Yet all the way back in the 4th century, a monk living in a bare cell in the Egyptian desert described this exact state in such precise detail that it reads like he was watching you through the screen. He cataloged the restlessness, the inability to focus, the way your mind tells you that anything would be better than what you're doing right now, the way you pick something up, set it down, and pick it up again. He watched this pattern destroy people, and his community considered it one of the most dangerous psychological afflictions a human being could face. They called it the Noonday Demon, and if you stick around to the end, you'll see what they did to fight it and how you can apply those principles in the present day. Evagrius Ponticus was born around 345 CE in the Roman province of Pontus in what is now northern Turkey. He was brilliant, well-connected, and trained by some of the most important Christian theologians of his era. He had every reason to stay in the cities and climb the ecclesiastical ladder. Instead, around his mid-30s, he walked away from all of it and moved to the desert communities of Egypt, where he would spend roughly the last 16 years of his life in near total solitude. He wasn't alone in doing this. Across the 3rd and 4th centuries, thousands of men and women left Roman imperial society for the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. They lived as hermits or in small, loose-knit communities, and while the religious motivation was real, what they were doing in practice was something remarkably close to a psychological experiment. Strip away every distraction, every social role, every comfort, every external source of stimulation, and then sit in a cell and observe what your mind does. Watch the patterns and record them. Evagrius recorded them with extraordinary precision. He identified 8 recurring patterns of destructive thought, which he called logismoi. These were mental states that descend on you, often uninvited, pulling you apart from the inside before you even have the chance to make a conscious choice. He cataloged all 8, but the one he spent the most time on, the one he described in the most granular detail, was acedia. The word comes from the Greek acedia, meaning a lack of care, but that translation barely scratches the surface. Evagrius called it the Noonday Demon, borrowing a phrase from the Septuagint translation of Psalm 91, which speaks of the destruction that wastes at noonday. And his description of what this demon actually does to you is unsettling in its specificity. Acedia attacks, he writes, around the 4th hour and besieges the soul until the 8th hour, roughly 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. It makes the sun appear sluggish, as if it has stopped moving, as if the day will never end. It forces the monk to keep glancing at the window, watching for any visitor, anyone at all, to break the unbearable weight of the present moment. It fills the mind with a conviction that this place is wrong, that nothing good can happen here, that meaningful life is happening somewhere else, anywhere else, and you are rotting. At the same time, it makes you incapable of doing anything about it. You can't read. You pick up a text, get through a few lines, and set it down. You get up and pace. You sit back down. You feel heavy in the body but agitated in the mind. A miserable combination where you can neither act nor rest. You are pinned in place, loathing where you are, fantasizing about leaving, but utterly unable to do the one thing in front of you. That description was written 1700 years ago by a man who had never seen a screen, who had never heard of an algorithm, who lived in a mud brick cell in the Egyptian desert. And yet, if you read it honestly, it's a remarkably similar situation to what we all do with our phones. The restlessness, the inability to focus, the sense that time is stretching out unbearably, the compulsive glancing, not at a window, but at a screen. The fantasy that something better exists just a little further down the feed, the picking up and putting down, the paralysis between action and rest, where you can do neither, and so you do this awful thing in between that serves no one, least of all yourself. Evagrius wasn't guessing. He had sat in that cell for years. He had watched the state move through himself and through the monks around him. He had seen men leave the desert entirely because of it, convinced that the location was to blame. He understood, with a clarity most modern commentary on phone addiction misses, that this crisis went far deeper than mere discipline. Evagrius' framework treated sadness as grief, a response to a specific, nameable wound. Acedia operates differently, draining the color from everything simultaneously without a single identifiable loss to mourn. The person in the grip of Acedia hasn't lost something they care about. They've lost the ability to care at all. The will has been severed from its purpose. This distinction matters because it changes what the problem actually is. We typically treat laziness with discipline and sadness with comfort. Acedia demands an entirely different vocabulary because it represents a total collapse of meaning. The person experiencing it hasn't decided that their work is unimportant. Something deeper has gone offline, something beneath the level of conscious decision, and no amount of willpower can manually restart it. The monks knew this. They had watched too many good, disciplined, devout men get swallowed by it to believe that effort alone was the answer. John Cassian, who was born around 360 CE and spent years living in these same Egyptian desert communities, eventually carried their teachings westward to Gaul, what we now call southern France. He founded monasteries there and wrote extensively about the inner life of monks, drawing directly on what he'd witnessed and experienced in Egypt. His book, The Institutes, written around 420 CE, devotes an entire section to Acedia, and it contains one of the sharpest observations anyone has ever made about this state. Cassian noticed that the monk afflicted by Acedia becomes convinced that the problem is external. The cell is too small, the community is too dull. If he could just be somewhere else with different people doing different work, then he would thrive. The fantasy is vivid and convincing, and sometimes the monk acts on it. He leaves, he travels to a new community, a new city, a new life. And surprise, surprise, the Acedia follows him. It follows him because it was never about the cell. The cell was just the place where he finally had to sit with himself long enough to notice what was happening. The restlessness, the aversion, the inability to engage, all of it traveled with him because all of it lived inside him. The changing of the scenery did nothing except delay the confrontation. If you've ever closed one app only to open another, told yourself you'd feel better if you just had a different job or lived in a different city or had a different relationship, and then found the same hollow feeling waiting for you on the other side of the change, you live Cassian's observation firsthand. The monks figured this out in the 5th century. We are still, by and large, figuring it out now. The monks developed a treatment protocol for Acedia, and it reveals how seriously they took it as a threat. Evagrius' first prescription sounds almost brutally simple. Stay in the cell. Don't leave. When every fiber of your being is screaming that you need to be somewhere else, that this is pointless, that relief exists just beyond the door, you sit with it. You endure. He writes that the monk who successfully weathers a bout of acedia finds, on the other side of it, a peaceful state and an indescribable joy. The resistance itself was the medicine. Fleeing only reinforces the delusion that the location is the problem, guaranteeing the acedia will return stronger next time. But Evagrius was also a realist. He knew that just endure it is not a complete answer, especially for something this powerful. And the tradition that grew up around his work added layers of practical structure to the prescription. Cassian, writing a generation later from his monasteries in Gaul, emphasized manual labor above almost everything else. When the mind is spiraling and the will has gone limp, you engage the body. You don't sit in your cell and try to think your way back to God. You get up and work with your hands. You weave baskets, tend the garden, bake bread. The monks of Egypt supported themselves through this kind of labor, and Cassian saw it serve a double purpose. It kept the community fed, and it quietly reconnected the paralyzed monk to something tangible and real. Your hands are busy, your body is in motion, and through the body, the will begins to reawaken. Cassian also insisted on something the modern world has almost entirely abandoned in its approach to this problem: communal accountability. The monks watched each other. They knew the signs. When a brother started lingering at the window, when he began talking about how much better life would be in another community, when he stopped showing up fully to the daily rhythm, the others intervened, but refrained from shaming. They recognized what was happening because they had been through it themselves, and they stepped in before the acedia could convince him he was alone in it. Over time, the monastic tradition built something even more fundamental than individual treatments. It built a daily structure designed to prevent acedia from gaining a foothold in the first place. The rhythm of ora et labora, prayer and work, alternated through the day at fixed intervals. You prayed, then you worked with your hands, then you prayed again, then you ate together, then you worked again. The Benedictine rule, written around 530 CE by Benedict of Nursia, who drew directly on Cassian's teachings, codified this rhythm down to the hour. The day was partitioned so that you never sat in any single mode long enough for the demon to settle in. The entire structure was, in a sense, an immune system built against acedia, and three things made it work. First, it was embodied. The treatment ran through the hands and the body, not just the mind. Second, it was communal. No one was expected to fight alone, and watching for acedia in your brothers was everyone's responsibility. Third, it was rhythmic and consistent. The structure didn't depend on motivation or inspiration. It was the shape of the day, every day, regardless of how you felt when you woke up. No one was told to simply try harder. For roughly 2 centuries after Evagrius, the concept of acedia held its shape. Monks understood it, watched for it, built their lives around resisting it. It had a name, a detailed description, and a communal response. Then slowly, it was forgotten. Pope Gregory I, writing in the late 6th century, reorganized the 8 patterns of destructive thought into what would become the 7 deadly sins. In doing so, he folded acedia into a broader category that would eventually be called sloth. On the surface, this looks like a minor administrative decision, a theological reshuffling, but what actually happened was a profound loss of precision. Sloth means you aren't working hard enough. It's a behavioral complaint. You're idle when you should be productive. The fix is obvious. Get up and do something. But acedia, as Evagrius and Cassian understood it, was never about idleness. A monk in the grip of acedia might pace in his cell for hours. He might travel to a new city. He might fill his days with frantic activity and still be consumed by it. Acedia stripped the meaning from the motion, regardless of how active or frantic the monk appeared. Gregory took a diagnosis of the soul and reduced it to a diagnosis of the schedule. Nearly 7 centuries later, Thomas Aquinas tried to pull it back. Writing in the 13th century, he defined acedia as sorrow in the face of spiritual good. That's a remarkable phrase. It describes someone who looks directly at the thing that should give their life depth and purpose and feels only a heavy, inexplicable revulsion. Aquinas recognized this state as a profound existential ache, a mourning for a connection you can sense you should have, but cannot seem to make. He was reaching back toward what Evagrius had originally meant. But Aquinas was swimming against the current. The popular understanding had already calcified. Acedia was sloth. Sloth was laziness. Laziness was a moral failing you could fix by getting out of bed earlier. And so the Western world lost its most precise term for a psychological state that never went away, that kept showing up in every generation, in every culture, wearing whatever costume the era provided. We just stopped being able to recognize it for what it was because we no longer had the word to describe it. And without the word, we lost everything that came with it. The communal vigilance, the structured prevention, the understanding of this state as a predictable, universal affliction of the human mind. All of that infrastructure quietly collapsed, and in its place we got a vague sense of guilt about being unproductive, which is, if you think about it, almost the opposite of what the monks were saying. They weren't telling you to produce more. They were telling you that your soul had lost contact with its purpose, and that no amount of productivity could substitute for that. So here we are, 17 centuries after Evagrius sat in his cell and mapped the contours of this thing we are experiencing on a civilizational scale, and we have almost no language for it. Doomscrolling is the word we've settled on, and it tells you a lot about how shallow our understanding is. The word treats the behavior as the problem. You scroll too much. The solution then is to scroll less. Download an app that locks your phone after an hour. Set boundaries. Practice digital discipline. The entire conversation begins and ends with the screen, as if the screen invented the condition rather than simply giving it a new surface to play out on. Evagrius would have seen through this immediately. The monk who paces his cell isn't sick because of the cell. The behavior is a symptom, and treating symptoms while ignoring the disease is how you guarantee the disease spreads. The phone has become what the cell was, the confined space where you sit with yourself. But there's a crucial difference. The phone offers something the monk never had, an infinite false exit. Every scroll is a tiny flight from the cell, a micro-enactment of exactly what Cassian warned against. The fantasy that relief is somewhere else, just a little further, just one more swipe. But the relief never arrives because the feed never ends. You are performing the act of fleeing without ever actually going anywhere. The monks at least had to pack a bag and walk to another city. Now we can run from ourselves without moving our thumb more than an inch. But this raises an uncomfortable question. Why is the Acedia there in the first place? Evagrius' monks had an answer to the question, why am I here? They were pursuing union with God. You can find that answer compelling or not. The point is that they had one, and it was reinforced every single day by the rhythm of their community, the structure of their hours, the presence of brothers who shared the same orientation. Acedia attacked them despite having that foundation. It was a temporary siege on a structure that was otherwise intact. And that's exactly why the treatments worked. Staying in the cell worked because there was something real to stay for. Manual labor worked because it reconnected you to a life that already had a shape. Communal accountability worked because you were surrounded by people walking the same path. The foundation held, and then the storm passed. For most people today, the foundation is what's missing. The doomscrolling doesn't descend on an otherwise meaningful life like a temporary affliction. It fills the space where meaning would go. It is what you do when you don't have an answer to the question, why am I here? And when no structure around you is offering one. This is not a personal failing. We live in a culture that has, over the past few centuries, systematically disassembled the structures that used to provide meaning by default. Religious community, craft labor where you held a product of your own hands, dense local bonds where your role was legible and your presence mattered to specific people who would notice if you disappeared. Seasonal rituals that gave the year a shape beyond quarterly earning reports. These structures were not perfect. Many of them were oppressive, exclusionary, or stifling in ways we rightly move beyond. Nobody is saying we should rebuild them wholesale, but we dismantled them without replacing them with anything that serves the same function, and then we told each individual person to construct their own meaning from scratch, alone, as a private project. Find your passion, discover your purpose, build your personal brand. The language of modern meaning making is almost entirely individualistic. For some, this works. They are able to find meaning entirely their own. But for so many of us, it doesn't. And here we are by the millions, left stranded in the modern world with no purpose, just existing. The monks would have found this absurd. They understood what the modern self-help industry has almost completely missed. Meaning emerges from sustained commitment to practices, people, and rhythms that are larger than you. Introspection and willpower alone cannot generate it. You find it by showing up repeatedly to something beyond yourself, until the showing up becomes the meaning. The monks prayed the same prayers at the same hours alongside the same brothers, and the meaning accumulated like sediment, slowly, through repetition, until it was strong enough to hold when Acedia came. We have almost entirely lost this understanding, and in its absence, we've replaced it with a cruel irony. When someone is doomscrolling at midnight, unable to stop, unable to sleep, unable to engage with anything real, we tell them the problem is the phone. We tell them they lack discipline. We tell them to try a digital detox, as if a week without screens will rebuild a foundation that took centuries to erode. We have taken a crisis of meaning and repackaged it as a crisis of willpower. And in doing so, we've done something worse than what Pope Gregory I did when he collapsed Acedia into sloth. At least he kept it in the category of spiritual affliction. We've moved it into the category of personal failure. And an even deeper irony is this: the reason it feels so intensely personal is exactly why you cannot solve it alone. Meaning was never supposed to be a solo project. You're not failing to find your purpose. You're trying to do by yourself what every previous generation did with the support of structures that have largely disappeared. The monks would not have blamed you for the Acedia. They would have looked at the world you're living in, a world with no shared rhythm, no communal accountability, no embodied daily practice connecting you to something beyond your own skull, and they would have said, of course the demon came. The door has been left wide open. Thank you so much for watching. This was Folks of Yore. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing, and leave a comment about your thoughts. You all have been leaving such thoughtful comments, so please keep them coming. We just reached 10,000 subscribers. We cannot thank you enough for the support and are so happy that so many of you are watching and enjoying our content. Thanks again, and see you next time.